My name is Emma, and I am 40 years old. For most of my life, I have been introduced at family gatherings the same way, with a small smile and a slightly lowered voice, like I was a footnote in someone else's story. After my mother died, my father married a woman named Renee. Renee cared deeply about three things: appearances, status, and the Harlow Country Club, where she spent most of her weekends performing the version of herself she liked best. From the moment she walked into our home, she made it quietly, consistently clear that I did not meet her standard. Not my apartment. Not my salary. Not my clothes. Not my friends. For years I absorbed it, smiled through it, and said nothing. Then one evening in her kitchen, in front of a room full of her friends, Renee raised her wine glass, looked directly at me, and called me the poor relative. And the whole room laughed. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. It was a Friday evening in October when it happened. Renee was hosting one of her dinner parties, the kind where every candle was placed with a ruler and every guest arrived already laughing too loudly. I had come because my father asked me to. I stood near the kitchen island, holding a glass of water I hadn't touched, listening to conversations I wasn't part of. Then Renee's friend asked her, casually, how the family was doing. Renee turned and looked straight at me. The smile she wore was the kind that knew exactly what it was doing. She raised her wine glass slightly and said, clear enough for everyone to hear, "Oh, we're wonderful." Emma's still finding her way. Then she paused, and added the part that turned my stomach to stone. She'll always be the poor relative, won't she? The room laughed. My father looked at his plate. I stayed another 20 minutes because leaving immediately felt like admitting she had broken something. Then I excused myself, drove home, and sat in my car in the parking lot outside my apartment building for a long time without going inside. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. I wasn't crying. I was thinking. Later, through the thin wall between the hallway and my father's study, I could hear Renee on the phone with one of her friends from that evening. Her voice was easy and satisfied. She'll never amount to anything, she said. She's waiting for someone to hand her a life. I walked to my bedroom, opened my wardrobe, and pulled out my weekend bag. I packed slowly and carefully, the way you do when you want to make sure you aren't forgetting anything important. By the time I was done, I had made myself one promise. I was never going back. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery on Clement Street. The rent took most of my paycheck. The radiator knocked every night at 2 in the morning. The window in the bathroom had a crack in it that let in cold air no matter how much tape I used. I bought groceries in small amounts and cooked everything from scratch because it was cheaper. I didn't call my father for 2 weeks. When he finally called me, I answered, kept it brief, and didn't mention Renee. What I had, which she had never once considered, was a finance degree from a university I had paid for myself through 3 years of part-time work and one very small scholarship. I had 6 years of solid accounting experience, 2 professional references who would go to the mat for me, and a quiet, patient kind of anger that had nowhere useful to go yet. But it would. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered so casually I almost missed its significance. I was sitting across from a client at the small accounting firm where I worked, a man named Howard Baxter, semi-retired, careful with money, and in the habit of mentioning things without seeming to. He was talking about diversifying a portion of his portfolio when he paused and said, almost to himself, that the Harlow Country Club was expanding its investment portfolio and looking for outside financial consultants to manage part of it. He said it the way people mention weather. I wrote it down after he left. That evening I looked up the club's board structure, their current financial disclosures, and the names of the people who ran their investment committee. I sat with that information for 3 days before I did anything with it. I wanted to be sure I wasn't acting out of emotion. I was absolutely certain I wasn't. I applied on a Thursday morning. I put together a proposal document that took me 4 evenings to finish. Clean, conservative, built around long-term stability rather than aggressive growth. I knew the type of institution Harlow was. Old money, risk-averse, deeply loyal to whoever made them feel safe. I wrote for that audience specifically. I sent the application and told no one. I expected to wait 2 weeks and then receive a polite rejection. Instead, they called me the following Monday. The woman on the phone had a measured, professional voice and said the investment committee had reviewed my materials and would like to invite me in for a preliminary meeting. She gave me a date and a time. I wrote them both down, thanked her, hung up, and sat quietly for a moment at my kitchen table. The bakery below me was just opening for the morning. The smell of bread came up through the floor. I allowed myself one small smile. I arrived at the meeting 15 minutes early and waited in a sitting room with dark wood paneling and paintings of horses on the walls. When the committee filed in, I recognized most of them from my research. The chairman was a man named George Whitfield, mid-60s, silver hair, the kind of person who had been trusted with serious money for a very long time. He shook my hand and studied my face for a moment longer than felt accidental. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I knew your father years ago," he said. "Before he made his money. He was a hard worker. Honest." He said it simply, like a fact he thought I should have. I thanked him and didn't elaborate. But I felt the weight of it. He wasn't offering me anything based on my father's name. He was telling me he already had a frame for what I might be. I intended to fill it well. The meeting was held inside the club itself. I had driven past the Harlow Country Club many times over the years, always from the outside, always through a window. Walking through the front entrance for the first time felt strange in a way I hadn't predicted. The lobby was quieter than I expected. Deep carpet. Low flower arrangements. Staff who moved without hurrying. I had prepared myself to feel out of place, and I was surprised to find that I didn't. I felt focused. I carried my presentation folder and followed a young assistant through a corridor lined with black and white photographs of the club's early members. I didn't look for Renee's face in those photographs, but I thought about her. I thought about her wine glass. I thought about her voice, easy and certain, telling her friend I would never amount to anything. Then the assistant opened a door, and I walked into the boardroom. I was gathering my materials after the presentation when I saw her. Renee was standing in the main lobby at the far end of the corridor, laughing with two women I recognized from her dinner parties. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer and holding a glass of sparkling water, completely at home. She hadn't seen me. I stood still for a moment and watched her. She looked exactly as she always did in this kind of setting. Polished, comfortable, surrounded by people who reflected her own sense of importance back to her. I was not ready for that encounter, and I knew it. Not because I was afraid of her, but because the timing wasn't right. What I had was still fragile. A good meeting. A promising start. Nothing confirmed. I turned and walked back toward the exit without drawing her attention. The moment would come. I just needed to make sure I was standing on solid ground when it did. The committee didn't make a decision that day, which I had anticipated. George Whitfield walked me to the exit himself and told me they had 2 other consultants to speak with and would be in touch within 10 days. He shook my hand again and said my proposal was the most coherent thing they had seen in several months. I drove home carefully, resisting the urge to read too much into that. Back at my apartment, I made tea, sat at my kitchen table, and went through my notes from the meeting. 3 committee members had pushed back on my growth timeline. I wrote down their exact objections and spent the following 2 evenings building responses to each one. If they called me back, I would be ready. If they didn't, I would find another door. But I believed they would call. I had watched their faces during the presentation. These were people who recognized careful thinking when they saw it. George Whitfield called me himself on the 9th day. He didn't spend long on pleasantries. He said the committee had discussed my proposal in depth, that my answers to their follow-up questions had been thorough, and that they wanted to talk about something broader than a short-term consulting arrangement. He asked if I would be available to come back in the following week. I said yes. After the call, I went for a long walk along the waterfront to clear my head. The evening was cold and the light was going flat over the water. I thought about what a longer arrangement might mean. The access, the credibility, the slow, quiet distance it would put between me and every version of myself that Renee had tried to make permanent. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post anything. I walked until my feet were tired, then went home and went to bed. Some things were better kept close until they were real. My father called that same week. His voice had that careful quality it got when he was passing along information he didn't entirely want to deliver. He told me that Renee had been talking about me at a lunch with her friends, that she had told them I was struggling, that she had said, with what he described as real certainty, that I would probably call him soon asking for help. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked how he was doing, and we talked for a few minutes about something else entirely. I didn't tell him about the club. I didn't tell him about George Whitfield or the second meeting or the quiet building momentum of the last several weeks. I wanted Renee to find out a different way. I had been thinking about what that way might look like, and I was starting to understand that the most powerful version of this story was the one where I said nothing at all until the truth simply walked into the room. The second meeting at the club was shorter and more direct. George Whitfield sat across from me with 2 other board members and explained what they were actually proposing. They wanted someone to manage a defined portion of the club's long-term investment portfolio on an ongoing advisory basis. Not a one-time project. A sustained role with quarterly reviews and direct access to the full committee. He said it plainly without theater. Then he added the part that changed the shape of everything. Because the role required regular access to club facilities and internal financial records, they were proposing to extend me full membership as part of the arrangement. He said it as though it were a practical matter, which it was. I kept my expression even and professional. I said I was very interested and would review the formal terms carefully. Inside, I was perfectly, completely still, the way you go still when something lands that you have been moving toward for a long time. The membership committee was a separate process, and it did not go smoothly at first. There were 4 older members who sat on the admissions board, and 2 of them made their hesitation clear without being direct about it. One asked about my connections to the community. Another asked how long I had lived in the area. The questions were polite and the resistance underneath them was obvious. George Whitfield spoke on my behalf without being asked. He said, in the measured tone of someone who did not feel the need to raise his voice, that I was already managing a portion of the club's financial future and that membership was both appropriate and overdue. The vote was taken. It passed by a margin that was narrow enough to be noted and wide enough to be final. I thanked the committee, shook hands with everyone in the room, and walked out into the corridor feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Forward. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was cream-colored, heavy paper, with the Harlow Country Club crest embossed on the back flap. I opened it at my kitchen table before work, still in my coat. The letter inside was short. A formal welcome. My membership number. A note about collecting my member card at the front desk at my convenience. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. I placed the envelope in the small wooden box on my bookshelf where I kept documents that mattered. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Renee had walked into that club for the first time as a member 14 years ago, on the arm of a man she had married in part for exactly this kind of access. I had walked in through a door I had built myself, carrying a proposal I had written alone at a kitchen table above a bakery. I went to work. My father called again the following week. He mentioned, in the scattered way he mentioned things he thought might be sensitive, that Renee was organizing a charity brunch at the Harlow Country Club. She had been planning it for months. She had invited a large number of people, club members, local business owners, friends from her various social committees. It was, by his account, the event she had been looking forward to most that season. She had ordered flowers from a special florist. She had arranged for a string duo to play in the entrance hall. My father sounded proud of her in the distracted way he always did when she was in her element. I listened, asked a few polite questions about the date and the format, and then said very little. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I opened my email and wrote a short note to George Whitfield asking about the upcoming charity brunch. George replied the same afternoon. He said the brunch was a significant event on the club calendar and that as a new member, my attendance would be welcomed and valuable. He mentioned that several of the club's major donors would be present and that it was a good opportunity for me to begin building relationships with the broader membership. He said he hoped I would come. I replied that I would be glad to attend. I did not mention that the woman hosting the event was my stepmother. I did not mention the dinner party or the wine glass or the particular way she had said the words poor relative while her friends laughed around her. None of that was relevant to George Whitfield. What was relevant was my work, my membership, and my presence. Everything else was between Renee and whatever version of that morning she was going to have to carry home with her afterward. I arrived at the club at 10 minutes past 9 on the morning of the brunch. The parking lot was already half full. I had worn a charcoal blazer I had bought the previous year and barely used, a white blouse and dark trousers. Not because I was trying to look like I belonged. I had already passed that threshold. I wore them because they were clean and professional and appropriate. The front entrance was decorated with white flower arrangements that must have cost more than my weekly groceries. A staff member held the door. Inside, the entrance hall was warm and softly lit, the string duo already playing something understated near the window. A woman at the welcome desk looked up, and before I could give my name, she smiled and said, "Good morning, Ms. Emma. Welcome." I walked into the main room. The brunch was already filling up. And at the far end, near the floral centerpiece she had clearly approved herself, was Renee. She saw me at the same moment I saw her. I watched it happen across the room, the recognition arriving in stages. First her eyes found my face, and there was a half-second of pure blankness. Then her expression did something complicated. The smile she had been wearing for her guests didn't disappear, but it stopped being real. She said my name as a question. "Emma?" Her two friends standing with her turned to look. I recognized them both from the dinner party in October, the same women who had laughed when she raised her glass. I walked toward them at a normal pace, not hurrying, not performing anything. I greeted Renee by name. I greeted her friends politely. Then one of them asked, with the careful brightness of someone trying to understand the situation, whether I was there as someone's guest. I looked at her pleasantly and said, "No, I'm a member." Renee laughed. It was a quick, dismissive sound, the kind designed to reframe something before it could take hold. She said that guests were always welcome at charity events, and that the sign-in table was just near the front desk. She said it in the helpful tone of someone correcting a small misunderstanding. Before I could respond, a staff member appeared at my shoulder. He was one of the senior floor managers, a tall man named Peter, who had greeted me by name twice during my previous visits. He looked at me directly and said, "Good morning, Ms. Emma. Mr. Whitfield mentioned you'd be joining us today. Can I show you to your seat?" Renee stopped talking. Her friends went quiet. One of them glanced between me and the staff member with an expression that was trying very hard to stay neutral. Renee's face had gone a particular shade of still that I recognized from a long time ago. It was the face she made when something had happened that she hadn't planned for. George Whitfield found me about 20 minutes later, near the window overlooking the garden. He shook my hand warmly and asked how I was settling in. We talked for several minutes about the next quarterly review and a new low-risk instrument I had flagged the previous week. At some point, one of the club's major donors joined our conversation, and George introduced me formally, mentioning my role in managing part of the club's investment strategy. The donor asked several informed questions. We talked for nearly 15 minutes. I was aware, without looking directly, that Renee was nearby with her group. When the donor excused himself, he said it had been genuinely useful to meet me. George nodded and said to the small circle that had gathered that the club's financial position had strengthened considerably in recent months. He said one person deserved most of the credit. Then he looked at me. The room was polite and warm in the way rooms are when something real has just been said. She found me near the end of the brunch, in the short corridor that led from the main room toward the garden terrace. She had clearly been waiting for a moment when we were out of earshot of her friends. She stepped close and kept her voice low, but her eyes were sharp. "You must have impressed someone," she said. "But this isn't your world, Emma. You know that." She said it the same way she had always said things to me, with absolute certainty, the way someone speaks when they have never once been seriously challenged on what they believe. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about every version of this conversation I had rehearsed in my head over the past several months. Then I let all of them go. "I didn't impress anyone, Renee," I said quietly. "I did the work. And for once in my life, the work was enough." I turned and walked back toward the main room. George made a short address near the end of the brunch, as the dessert plates were being cleared. He thanked the donors, acknowledged the staff, and then said he wanted to take a moment to mention something that had come up at the last board meeting. He said the club's investment portfolio had shown its strongest growth in 6 years over the past 2 quarters. He said the board had made a decision to bring in specialist advisory support and that the results had exceeded expectations. He named me clearly and asked the room to acknowledge the work. The applause was warm and genuine. I nodded my thanks from where I sat, keeping my expression measured. Across the room, Renee was clapping with everyone else. Her hands were moving and her face was arranged correctly, but she was not present behind it. She looked like someone watching something happen that she had no way to stop and no language to explain. My father came to find me before I left. He had been invited to the brunch as Renee's guest, which I had known and quietly noted. He walked up slowly with his hands in his pockets, the way he did when he was uncertain how a conversation would land. He said my name. I turned. He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched him trying to find the right starting point for something he had been avoiding for a very long time. I should have said something, he finally told me. Back then in the kitchen. I should have said something. His voice was low and it was honest, and I could hear the weight behind it. I nodded once. I told him I knew. I wasn't ready to do more than that in this room at this event, with Renee 20 feet away watching us from behind her empty champagne glass. But it was a beginning. I could see that in his face too. A few weeks after the brunch, George mentioned something to me during a routine check-in call. He said the board had recently reviewed several investment proposals that had come in through informal channels, ideas that some of the longer-standing members had been pushing in casual conversations. He said the proposals were high-risk, poorly structured, and not aligned with the club's stated financial strategy. The board had declined all of them. He didn't use Renee's name, and I didn't ask. But I had heard, through my father, that she had been enthusiastically promoting a particular investment opportunity to her friends in the club for the past several months, convinced that her social influence would carry it through. I said nothing to George about the connection. I just agreed that the board had made the right call and moved the conversation forward. Renee's currency at Harlow had always been her social standing, and social standing, I was learning, was a much more fragile thing than actual work. I saw her one last time that season, on a quiet Thursday afternoon in the clubhouse restaurant. I was having lunch with 2 members of the investment committee, going over projections for the following year. She came in with one friend, not the usual group. They were seated at a table near the window. At some point I looked up and our eyes met across the room. She looked away first. Not dramatically. Not with any particular feeling on her face. She simply looked away and turned back to her friend and continued her conversation. I watched her for one moment longer. The woman who had raised her wine glass in her kitchen and called me the poor relative in front of everyone she wanted to impress. She was still here, still lunching, still moving through her world. But something had shifted in the geometry of it. She no longer occupied the same position. And I had not taken it from her. I had simply built something real in a place she had told me I would never belong. That was all. That was everything.